Good morning. We come in our daily Bible reading to John chapter 9. And in the 9th chapter of the Gospel of John, we find a case in point example of Jesus working a powerful miracle, a powerful sign to explain that he is from above, and the Jews of the earth who reject that at every turn. Now it's interesting because we'd like to say that if we were the Jews, we would know Jesus is the Messiah. We would know he was the Jesus of prophecy. And certainly if we saw a miracle, we would believe. But what we see in John chapter 9 is that wasn't the case. And some even maybe understanding who he was were unwilling to make that claim with boldness, the way that Jesus requires of us. So with an honest heart and open mind, let's look at John chapter 9 and see Jesus working a powerful miracle and the lengths to which others would go to reject him as the Son of God that he claimed to be. In John chapter 9 and verse 1, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Now Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. And as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." So a couple instant lessons that we can get from this story is that, number one, when bad things happen, they're not always because somebody deserved it. I think we need to be really careful, not only with ourselves, that when bad things happen to us to say, well, what did I do wrong? While self-evaluation is good, this man wasn't born blind because he did wrong, and he wasn't born blind because his parents did wrong. Sometimes these things happen. But I'm more concerned with how do I look at other people? When I see people struggling, for example, or when I see them in tough life circumstances, do I think to myself, well, it really is their fault? Or do I take the time to understand that maybe not everyone deserves bad things happening to them, even though in this world those things do? In a fallen world, bad things happen, some in our control and some not. We need to make sure we help those who God would look at with joy and with compassion like Jesus does. Now, as we think about Jesus and his opportunity here, he does look at this situation as a positive one where he can display, verse 3, the works of God. Now, as a man born blind, this individual was apparently and would be known by many in the community because he would always be blind. He would need to be helped. He would be reliant upon others to be sustained. And Jesus is going to work a miracle, but notice in verse 6, he does it in a very interesting way. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Powerful miracle, but it does beg one question. And no, the question is not gross, why spit? Right? The question is, if Jesus can heal from distance, if Jesus can heal instantaneously, why would Jesus spit in the mud, put mud on his eyes, and make him go and do something to heal him? It seems very peculiar. And the truth is, I don't know that we have a case in point example, a 100% ironclad rationale for why Jesus did what he did. But allow the story to progress, and let's come back to the idea of why would Jesus spit in the mud, cover the man's eyes, have him go wash in a pool, and then have his eyesight restored? If you want to pause the video for a moment and kind of register some family guesses or some family educated guesses or understandings of why this might be, now would be a good time to pause that video and cement those ideas. Well, as we study the chapter, let's see what Jesus does with this man who has been healed, this man who can now see. Well, what we see in verses 8 through 10 is that this catches everyone's attention, as you'd expect. They now all of a sudden see this blind man from birth, and he can see. And they're like, is this the man we know? Is this who we understand him to be? Because the man I knew was blind. And so they know a miracle has transpired. So the question is, what do they do with it? Well, in verse 11, they asked the man, and he says, "The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." Now they said to him, "Where is he?" And he said, I do not know. So here's verse 13 where the story gets interesting. So they brought him to the Pharisees, the man who had formerly been blind. Now, it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how he received his sight. And of course, he explains that it was Jesus who put mud on his eyes, how he was washed, and how he had his sight restored. And the Pharisees, 16, at least some of them, say, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." So there the Pharisees go again, talking about Jesus working a miracle of healing on the Sabbath, and apparently viewing that as a disqualification or a breaking of the law, rather than a powerful miracle and a cause for joyous celebration. Interesting to see how far we'll go to reject truth. In verse 17, they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him since he has opened your eyes?" And he said, "He is a prophet." So the Pharisees have been discussing, well, maybe is this man a sinner in a verse we overlooked? Is he wrong? And if he is a sinner, then how come he can work this powerful sign? And so they say, well, man who now has a sight, who do you say that he is? And he said, well, he's a prophet. He must be what we might call a man of God. Maybe not the son of God, but a man of God. Well, in verse 18, the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight. Now, by the way, if it sounds ridiculous, the lengths to which the Jews and the Pharisees were going to reject this miracle, you're right, it is. This is absurd. But this just shows us when we have a deeply held belief and we come into the truth that sometimes conflicts with what we believe, if our hearts aren't open, we will look just like these silly, stubborn Pharisees and Jews. And the question is, will I keep an open heart and open mind? Right? Will I always be willing to change if someone presents truth to me? The Jews show some of them were not capable. So they call in the parents and they're trying to kill this theory that Jesus healed someone and gave him sight by saying, well, maybe he just never actually was blind and certainly not blind from birth. And the parents go in and they acknowledge, yes, this is our son. He was blind. But notice one thing the parents are unwilling to do. It's one thing to be stubborn to seeing truth, but notice in verse 21, how he sees now we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age. He will speak for himself. Now that sounds fairly innocuous, not a big deal, but notice verse 22. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. So the parents did what we might call kicking the can down the road. They said, you know what, you ask our son. We don't want to have to answer. Apparently, they thought Jesus was something special. Otherwise, this is no threat at all. So they realize they have a problem. Maybe they even believe in Jesus. They might be like those in John 12, 41 and 42, who believed in Jesus, but for fear of the Pharisees in verse 43, were unwilling to confess him, loving what man offered more than what God does. But as you look at this, and you see what they say in verse 23, they say, look, he is of age, ask him. So a second time, the Jews go to this man who has had his sight restored, and they ask him, they say to him, give glory to God, we know that this man is a sinner. And then they ask him in 26, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? How did he give you sight? And he said, I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? Now, I don't know if this was meant to goad them, but man, what a statement. For people who were doing everything they could, calling Jesus a sinner, a law Sabbath breaker, saying, well, then maybe he just actually didn't work a miracle. Maybe he had sight already, or he wasn't born blind, some sort of loophole like that. And this man says, why are you so interested? Do you want to be his disciple, his pupil? And they reviled him, saying, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. Do you see this badge of honor that they're wearing on their chest? Can you just imagine how happy this makes them? To be able to say, we are those committed to the law. We're the ones who are doing what's right. You're the one doing wrong. Well, as you come to verse 29, we know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. In verse 30, the man says, why is this an amazing thing? You do not know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And they answered him, you were born in utter sin, and would you teach us? And they cast him out. Do you see the blindness and stubbornness of heart of the Pharisees here, of the leading Jews? They said, no, we know what's happening. You were born guilty. You were born into guilt, and that's why we can't trust you. You would teach us when you were clearly born in sin because you were blind, apparently. That seems to be perhaps what they're reaching for. Of course, that's not the case at all. Jesus has made that clear at the beginning of the chapter. But let's bring back that thought from the beginning of the video. Remember those guesses or those ideas that we thought about earlier. Why would Jesus not just heal this man's vision? Why would he spit into the mud and put it on his eyes and have him wash it? Well, number one, it reminds us a lot maybe of 2 Kings chapter 5 and the story of Naaman, who had his leprosy removed by dipping in the Jordan. And you might say, well, why didn't he just get healed by God's great prophet there? Well, it seems that he was going to show his faith in the instructions and the instructor. But here, this man shows us a great case in point example. There are some who are blind, and when given the opportunity to be healed, they take it. Do you notice the blind man doesn't seem to argue with Jesus? He doesn't ask why, like Naaman. He doesn't throw a hissy fit. He just goes, washes, and is restored. That's faith. That's what Jesus wants. But on the other end of the spectrum, the Pharisees even see the miracle. And what do? They resist. They reject. They ignore. They put their heads in the sand. Jesus is not complimentary of this. In fact, in verse 35, when he finds the man again, he says, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And he says, "And who is he, sir, that I might believe in him?" And Jesus said, basically, "It's me." And notice what the man does. When our eyes are opened, what is our obligation? Verse 38, "Lord, I believe." And notice what it says, "And he worshiped him." That's what sight does. That's what belief does. But the Pharisees, on the other hand, in verse 40, some of them were near to him, and they said, "Are we also blind?" And Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, 'We see,' your guilt remains." Jesus, as a light in the world, made it very clear that God's will was becoming manifest in him. And so to believe in Jesus meant to believe in God. To ignore him, to purposely blind yourself to that light of the world, would mean to reject God's plan of salvation and reject the Father by extension. The Pharisees closed their eyes, hardened their hearts, and rejected even clear miracles. While this man heard the words of life, the words to receive sight for the first time in his life, and he went and he trusted. Do I have the kind of faith that just says how high when Jesus says to jump? Or am I like the Pharisees and say why? Or explain why I'm exempt from this particular command? John chapter 9 is a powerful example of what belief is and what it means to accept Jesus as our Lord. I hope you'll continue with our studies tomorrow as we study John chapter 10 in our daily Bible reading.